Okay, I'm Lai Leong with the Center for Presidential History. Today is September 26, 2015, and I'm honored to be speaking with Professor Larry Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Professor Wilkerson, let us start with the experience that you brought to your positions under the Bush administration, Bush 1. What was that?
I think the pertinent experience was 31 years in the United States Army, much of which was spent functionally looking at strategic issues, planning, formulating strategy for the military in the last 12 years at the highest levels, what I would call, not grand strategy, but I would call the national military strategy that fit into the national strategy itself. And my experience, which was regional in the East Asia and the Pacific. That's unusual for a soldier. Soldiers usually, during the Cold War, were experienced in Europe and Russian and other things. My experience was with the Japanese, the Koreans, the Filipinos, the Chinese, ultimately, the Indians, and others in Asia, but particularly East Asia, and particularly Northeast Asia.
And you had worked with Secretary Powell before?
Yes, I joined him in 1989 when he came out of the White House after being Reagan's deputy and then national security advisor. He became a four-star general and was put in charge of the United States Forces Command in Atlanta, Georgia. We had almost all the U.S. Army forces in the U.S., Virgin Islands, and other territories. And then I moved with him to Washington as his special assistant and speechwriter when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Were you involved at all in the campaign, in President Bush's campaign?
Not really, because Powell was asked to be Secretary of State, and the protocol for both Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State is to refrain from open politicking. We didn't get involved in it. Not to say that Powell didn't make a few remarks here and there, but basically we didn't get involved in politics, and we adhered to that mostly through the first 4 years. We even I personally had to tell people like Ken Mehlman and Karl Rove from time to time that I didn't do those sorts of things when they would bring us into meetings that were purely political. And at one meeting, I simply stood up 30 minutes through the meeting and said, "I'm out of here. I don't do this." Yeah.
This was before 2000?
No, this was during the administration when they wanted the secretary or people from the State Department to actually do political things, domestic political things.
So before 2000, though, did you contribute in any way to the sort of thinking that went into the Bush campaign as they aimed for the White House?
No, I did not, except as I was advising Powell. At that point, I had retired in 1997, and he had immediately hired me as a private consultant. So we were doing everything from Nigeria and the elections there with the Carter Center to writing speeches that he would give at various places. In that sense, if he were working with the Governor Bush, and I know he was from time to time, then I was influencing that work, but it was indirect.
So when you started in the Bush administration then, at that time, what was the perception of how U.S. policy had developed in East and Southeast Asia under the Clinton administration?
I think it's fair to say that when we were in the transition office, starting on 16 December 2000, we moved into the spaces there on the first floor of the Harry Truman Building, and we began to gather our team around us. We were of a mind that the policies we were probably going to be called upon to implement and pursue were going to be more or less like the ones we had seen so vividly in the H.W. Bush administration. Broadly speaking, multilateralism, involvement in the international community, support of the United Nations, maybe some unilateralism when it was called for. But basically, we were going to continue what we thought was pretty darn good foreign policy and security policy of Herbert Walker Bush. And I wrote and coordinated, and he contributed to his own confirmation testimony hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in that vein. So there was no disabusing of that feeling in us by the group that checked that confirmation testimony. I had to pass it through everyone, including the political types like Rove. It didn't get many changes, and you can go back and review that testimony. It could have been given for the Secretary of State for Herbert Walker Bush. It was very much a product of that kind of foreign policy. Engage multilateralism, cooperation where you could, maybe with regard to a few issues you might have to be unilateral. We were already suspicious that we'd have to be unilateral with regard to more or less the abrogation of the ABM Treaty. And we were talking about that because we didn't think that was the right way to go. But, we looked at it as something we discuss and debate with the other members of the national security team. We thought we were going to be doing another Bush, another H.W. Bush. That's the way we looked at it.
Was it a conscious effort in any way to make a switch from the Clinton's administration's approach?
We didn't encounter the dramatic ABC, anything but Clinton, at least I didn't, and I didn't see my secretary encountered it until we hit North Korea and the agreed framework. And we understood that people like John Bolton, who after all was our Undersecretary for International Security Affairs and Arms Control, and others in the administration, ultimately including the president himself, literally felt the agreed framework was anathema, and they wanted to discard it regardless. They didn't have a real plan for replacing it, though, and it took them a long time to come up with a plan for replacing it. In the meantime, in my view, we'd had as much responsibility for causing that framework to collapse as did the North Koreans. To this day, the CIA was unable to convince any of us which came first, North Korean cheating or North Korean moving to an enrichment program because they saw we were not living up to the agreed framework. We were not delivering the heavy fuel oil in the quantities necessary or on time. And more importantly, I think to them, we were not funding KEDO, the Korean Energy Development Organization, to the extent we should have and had promised to do. This was the Congress, of course. And so they couldn't build the light water reactors fast enough. North Koreans cheated. Now, my own opinion is they probably were hedging their bets anyway. They probably had secret enrichment facilities that they could turn to. Maybe even they intended to turn to them, but they definitely turned to them when they found we weren't living up to our part of the bargain. So we scuppered the agreement at the same time that we had no policy to replace it with.
Well, I'd like to touch on North Korea a little bit more further
Sure.
down. For the moment, still focused on that transitional period. When we spoke to Ambassador Armitage, for instance, he had suggested that there was some effort to move towards what he called a more muscular policy in East Asia. Would you agree with that?
I would agree only to the extent that we were developing this idea that Japan should grow up, like what Prime Minister Abe is doing today, for example. We weren't sure we wanted them to go fully into statehood, that is to say 1,000 nuclear weapons, ICBMs and everything else. But we did want Japan to be more muscular. We wanted them to participate in UN peacekeeping operations, Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. We wanted to be able to call upon the self-defense forces when we needed them in places. And we wanted them to shoulder physically more of their burden, break that 1% of GDP and, go up and start taking responsibility for their own security in many ways. In that sense, it was robust. And if you look at that closely, people like me would say to the secretary, as I did, be careful what you wish for. Not necessarily because Japan might become militaristic again, but you're really going to rile Beijing. So you have to be very, very careful about how you do this. You may be, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. In that sense, more muscular. And of course, we were looking at resuming relations with Indonesia after the tremendous problems with the Timorese and so forth. We had a whole generation of Indonesian military grow up with no contact with U.S. military, no IMET, no nothing. and they were very antagonistic towards the U.S. military, disdainful of us even, and we wanted to try and change that. So in those senses, yes. And Rumsfeld wanted desperately to get back into the Philippines. He used 9/11. He used 9/11 to get back into the Philippines. He made Abu Sayyaf, for example, Al-Qaeda-like, and used that excuse to get U.S. forces back on the ground in the Philippines. So yeah, in that sense, we were looking to beef up U.S. security policy in East Asia and Southeast Asia.
What were the motivations for that? Why was there felt like the need in the case of Japan, for instance?
I think it was physical in the sense that we wanted Japan. We felt the same thing about NATO, although we were very ambiguous about the way we dealt with NATO. One minute we wanted them to grow up and spend more money. The next minute we were fighting the European security identity and their willingness to do things aside from NATO and so forth. But yes, I think it was mostly, I won't say mostly, but it was part physical. We wanted some sharing. And it was part China, hedging what we called a hedging strategy with China. We didn't want war. Let me back up. There were some in the administration that wanted a new Cold War with China. Cheney and Rumsfeld were very much disposed that way. We didn't. We didn't think the president did. The president usually supported Powell on China policy. Most Americans don't understand how important that was. The president's sense, I think, was China was essential to Walmart. You couldn't have what we were having at that time in terms of an economy without China. And certainly Britain, Japan, and China were buying our debt, and so we had to have China. The president understood that intuitively, I think, and so he supported Powell more often than he supported Rumsfeld and Cheney, which was good. Like I said, most Americans don't understand that even went on. But basically it was physical and fear of China and hedging strategy. That's one reason we started, and I think now we have a culmination of, or at least a interim culmination, if you will, of new policy with regard to India. India was rapidly becoming the power in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean. I remember one very highly placed military officer telling me, we no longer look at the Atlantic as our prime security feature that way. We look at the Indian Ocean, we look at India as our maritime partner, and that was quite stunning to me because I'd been very much a part of, if not as much, the Pacific strategy, the Atlantic strategy for a long time. And so to hear a Navy admiral of that stature tell me that the Atlantic was no longer important because the Indian Ocean and India and others was quite a strategic shift. And that was all about China too. You know.
Well, that's not quite what I intended to pursue here, but nonetheless, that's interesting. When did that switch?
It began at the end of the Clinton administration, picked up some steam with Bush in the second Bush term, particularly with Evan Feigenbaum and the nuclear negotiations. Evan was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, and was given his head really with regard to that. The nuclear accord and so forth, which we had essentially said, not publicly, but within government, would never happen. We'd never have that kind of relationship with India where we would share nuclear technology to the extent that we knew they were going to shift some of that into their military program as well as in their civilian program. You can't hide that. I mean, Clinton started it, Bush gave it a real push, and I think President Obama has continued it, though I've not been as close to that as I was to the previous two. India's the new strategic ally that gives us real sense of comfort with regard to China.
So this somewhat recent talk about pivoting to Asia.
It already,
really happened.
This rhetoric, we pivot a carrier, and then it stays there for a day or two, and that's the pivot, and then we send the carrier back to the Med or back to the Indian Ocean. It's usually pretty balanced.
So going back to the motivations for a more muscular policy, So we talked about Japan. What about the Philippines? Why was Secretary Rumsfeld so keen on getting back into the Philippines?
I think it was a personal issue with him. He really didn't like the fact we'd been kicked out. He thought that was inept policy on the part of the Filipinos as well as us in allowing it to happen. I had been integral to that. With my admiral was Admiral Crow and then Admiral Ron Hayes' right-hand man on the Mutual Defense Board, and we had actually come to the conclusion that we were going to be thrown out, and instead of having it happen that way publicly, let's do it, and let's do it well, and let's part friends. We still got a treaty, we still got the MDB, we still got all this, but let's don't be rancorous about this. So the military had already accepted it and worked to smooth it over. So it's kind of stunning to those of us who knew about that process to watch Rumsfeld trying to essentially reassert the U.S. in a major way back into the archipelago. We didn't like it.
Prior to 9/11, how did he try to do that?
Well, prior to 9/11, I think he was just planning. Post 9/11, that gave him the excuse. Really, this government was very, very slow to get going. From my perspective, it looked almost like it didn't know what it was doing. We couldn't get the Korean review done. We couldn't get the sanctions review on Iraq. We were going to smarten up sanctions. That was the phrase, because we didn't like the publicity about hurting children and so forth and so on. So we wanted to take a whole swipe at the sanctions regime, change it completely so it was more focused, more precise, and it really hurt the leadership, particularly Saddam himself and his family. But we didn't go very fast. I was in policy planning at that time, and Richard Haas was just not moving very fast on those issues. And later I would learn that one of the reasons was because he was talking with Condi about, I don't know, once a day, twice a day or whatever, and he was really becoming alarmed over what he saw as a focus on Iraq and what was going to happen from that focus. This is pre-9/11.
Right.
I'll never forget him walking into policy planning one day and saying, "We're going to war with Iraq."
And when was this?
This was right after we went to Beijing for policy planning talks, so probably August of 2001. This is before 9/11. The Middle East specialists, we always had a meeting in the morning, and the Middle East specialists were sitting to Richard's front and immediate left, and I saw them perk up immediately. The rest of I was working the Far East and political military affairs, so it didn't catch me as much as it caught them, because they were, are you kidding me? You just charged us to work on smartening up sanctions in Iraq and to work on possible dialogue with Iran, and now you're telling me we're going to war with Iraq? Why? And Richard didn't pursue that any further that morning, but it did start a lot of his thinking. And because I was the oldest guy in policy planning and everybody knew that I had a pipe into Powell, generally at the end of the day, 6, 7 o'clock in the evening, everybody would come in my office and we'd yak. And so we began to yak about why and what is happening here. Let me back up a minute. The other thing that had happened is that Richard had really made a study of the policy planning staff. He had had Drew Erdman, who was an Eisenhower scholar in particular, go back and look at George Marshall, look at Harry Truman, Marshall's Secretariat, and so forth, and on forward. And one of the things he concluded from that analysis, that study, was we needed to have something he then called joint staff talks. That was the policy planning staff and the joint staff. And so we started those, and I was in charge of that. I met with General Casey, who was then the Joint Staff J5. He kind of perfunctorily said, "No problem," and he put a couple of colonels in with me. And we began having these talks. We shot for once a month, but we were meeting the first 2 months, twice a month. We started with China, then we moved to Korea and so forth, and pretty robust talks. Rumsfeld found out about it. Don't know whether Casey told him or what, probably just dropped it one day in a brief or something. Rumsfeld found out about it and killed it immediately. He did not want the State Department and the Defense Department coordinating without him knowing every single detail all the time, which was Rumsfeld's style. So the colonel came to me and said, I've got to stop these talks. I said, this is not good. Don't you think these are productive? He said, they're damn productive. Yeah, I'd like to continue them. So he took a chance. He said, we'll meet in Crystal City. I've got a space over there. We'll meet in Crystal City. And he said, by the way, next week we're reviewing the national military strategy with the graybeards, the old retired admirals and generals and so forth. Would you like to come and bring some of your people? I said, absolutely, I would. And by the way, how come the national military strategy is moving faster than the national security strategy? And he said, well, you know, the military, we can't wait for those assholes in the White House. And he was right. As I said, they were dragging their heels. They would not produce a national security strategy for a year or two. So here's the military going ahead and building the military component to it without the chapeau. Yeah, I wanted to come. So I came over there, brought a couple of my people, and we were in Crystal City for about 6 hours vetting the national military strategy with the retired 4-stars. At the end of that day, the colonel came out in the corridor as I was sipping some water and getting ready to get on my way back to state. And he said, I've got some bad news. Rumsfeld has let it be known that I won't go to brigade command if I continue this. And I've just been selected for brigade command. Now that's a real hurdle in the military. When you get selected for brigade command, you're probably going to make brigadier general. So I said, Colonel, I'm not about to jeopardize your career. We'll just have to stop. And so we stopped. And at that moment, in roughly June, early July, as I recall, it was right before we went to Beijing, we stopped all contact between the State Department and DOD other than Powell to Rumsfeld, Powell-Condi to Rumsfeld, or whatever. Disastrous decision. Rumsfeld at that time also pulled most of his military officers from all of their extracurricular duties, including the Congress. Newt Gingrich got angry about it. He pulled everybody back. He pulled all of them out of political military affairs at state, which was terrible because we needed those people for basing agreements. We needed advice. We needed those people on hand. He pulled them all back. Ostensibly, he pulled them back so he could count them and figure out what was going on with all these military officers that were spread over Washington. And then he would decide on which ones would go back. Well, because of the hue and cry in the Congress and elsewhere, the NSC staff, for example, he had to send a lot of them back. But he didn't send them all back. And in many cases, he sent less quantity back than was there before. Maybe it was a good organizational exercise, whatever, but it continued with the Joint Staff talks. They were dead. They were killed. We could not hold any more talks. So in future, I had to be furtive about the way I went to DOD to get this or that, to get briefed, to find out what was going on. And they had to be furtive about coming over and seeing us, which was really stupid. But that's the way we did it.
So it sounds like that's unusual. That's not the way
I've never
it
seen
works.
it. I've never seen it before. I mean, I'd been in the Clinton administration with Powell. I'd been in the H.W. Bush administration, and I'd watched the Reagan administration from time to time up pretty close. I've never seen it before, and now I've studied them all from Harry Truman forward, and I can say I don't think it's ever happened before.
Well, where was the National Security Council in all of this? I mean, wasn't it supposed to help coordinate some of that?
Yes, this is a strange beast in terms of the statutory decision-making process. It always is to a certain extent, of course, since the 47 Act. But this administration's first term its prominent feature was the vice president in running the statutory process. 1. 2, making it dysfunctional. And 3, when he couldn't make it dysfunctional or run it on a particular issue, like China, going to the Congress and caucusing with them and trying to get them to bring pressure on the White House so they'd stop. It was incredible to watch. Let me give you examples. Iran. There never was a national security decision document produced by the NSC with regard to policy on Iran because the vice president didn't want one. And so what he did was he made every meeting where that issue was discussed dysfunctional, either through Rumsfeld's surrogates, because Rumsfeld decided he would not come to NSC meetings and he'd send a second or a third who was not empowered to say much, or he would simply keep it off of the agenda. If it looked like maybe somebody might be inclined to make a reasonable argument or have a reasonable position and the president might get, interested, he'd keep it off the agenda. So by making the process dysfunctional, he kept us from ever making a decision about Iran policy, and therefore he got what he wanted, which was we don't speak to evil. That was his policy. Other ways he would end run, he developed his own NSC counterpart in his own office, to the extent that Bob Blackwell called me one day and said, they're reading my emails, but I'm not reading theirs. So I've quit using email. I either go face-to-face or telephonically. That was the degree to which Cheney's NSC staff, if you will, vice president's staff, had more power than the actual NSC staff. And it went in other ways too, that Cheney made sure worked. Scooter Libby, for example, was privy to the highest level formal NSC discussions, but the counterpart, functional regional on the NSC staff, was not privy to the discussions that Scooter and others were having with the vice president. I saw that vividly in the East Asia affairs when we would have an interagency working group chaired by Jim Kelly, Assistant Secretary for East Asia Pacific. We would have Steve Yates or someone from the vice president's office seated with us who would be very quiet throughout the deliberations of the interagency working group. When it looked as if the interagency working group was going to arrive at a recommendation to the deputies committee that was adverse to the vice president's position, with which Steve or whomever was well versed, they would then weigh in with the imprimatur of the vice president and kill the whole meeting, happened on North Korea a number of times. And Jim would just shrug his shoulders and, well, how do I end run this one? Because he knew that if he took that to the deputies committee, that the vice president would kill it. So why waste your time doing it? Cheney was everywhere, domestic and international. He was everywhere. He once caucused with the Congress in a way that probably was unconstitutional, but it's protocol and precedent more than it is law. So, Mike Mansfield once told LBJ when he was vice president for Kennedy to, get out of here. You know better. Get out of here. Leave. You shouldn't be here. Well, Cheney went over there, and in this particular tax package legislation, the president wanted two of the provisions in terms of tax cuts. He didn't want the third provision, which I think was the capital gains cut, if I remember right. And the vice president wanted all three. So what he did was he went over to the Congress and he said, he won't veto. Put all three in there. And so when all three came over in the legislation, the president had a choice. He could veto it or he could, sign, and he signed. So Cheney got what he wanted. Brilliant man in terms of bureaucratic entrepreneurship, bureaucratic, undermining other people. With regard to North Korea, my most dramatic memory was Powell finally got the president alone and talked him into releasing Jim Kelly at the multi-party talks from his straitjacket. He couldn't even talk to his North Korean counterpart. He had to talk through the Chinese or another member of the party talks. He could not talk directly to the North Korean. Powell convinced the president that not only was that not productive, but that maybe Jim ought to have a little more leeway in negotiations, period. The president agreed. Jim took off, I think for Beijing as I remember, and Cheney came back from Wyoming where he'd been fly fishing, went straight to the president, got the president to reverse his decision, and before Kelly took off from refueling at Pearl, we called him and told him he was back in his straitjacket. So Cheney had all manner of spies throughout the government. He knew exactly what was going on, and he knew when to weigh in and when to stop things. And he was way ahead of us all the time. He and Rumsfeld together beat the hell out of us. That's the fair truth. We didn't realize what they were doing to us until it was almost too late to recover on a lot of issues.
Did he do it with the president's knowledge, though? I mean, in this case,
it's always going to be my fundamental question. I'm finishing up my book now, and I cannot answer that question in my book. My former boss, Powell, says more often than not, the president was knowledgeable of what was happening, but not deeply knowledgeable. He didn't understand all the ramifications of what Cheney was doing. I'm convinced that from time to time my boss was wrong in that assessment, that the president actually did not know what Cheney was doing. Maybe one of the most dramatic examples of that is how the debate went on with regard to leaving the Geneva Conventions with regard to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We were having what was a very robust debate. And all of a sudden, the president signed the February 2002 memo, February 7th, as I recall, that essentially said, we're leaving Geneva for these two categories of combatants, and then put the sentence in there, but in accordance with our policies of the past, we will adhere to the spirit of Geneva, particularly referring to Common Article 3. That was done by Cheney's lawyer, David Addington, writing that. Cheney then put it in front of the president signed it. I don't think the president knew that the process had been abbreviated abruptly and that Rumsfeld and Cheney were simply handing him a legal position that he probably shouldn't be signing up to, or whether the president had, followed all the debates, because a lot of the debate was in the Deputies Committee and the Principals Committee, where the president was not often present, but Vice President Cheney was. So I don't know if the president appreciated that full debate and all the parameters and different issues that had been discussed. And all of a sudden, Cheney puts it in front of him, he signs it. That was the president's way, though. So from time to time, he was, I'm decisive, and bang, did it. Powell was shocked. So was his lawyer, Will Taft. Taft thought, we had a reasonable chance of winning the argument, and all of a sudden we lost. I think Cheney put that in front of the president and said, discussion's over, Mr. President, everybody agrees. And the sad thing about some of the principles was, even on Rumsfeld's side, when he would lose, they would just go out and try to subvert. They wouldn't go back and revisit. They wouldn't go back to the president. I think Bush's tendency to be decisive and then to stick to the decision dissuaded a lot of people from doing what normally would happen. You'd go back and you'd say, Mr. President, this is not a very smart decision. Let's talk about this a little more, or even maybe threaten to, this is a decision I cannot support. If you make this decision, I'll leave your government. Now, Mr. Mueller at the FBI, Mr. Ashcroft, and I understand the Secretary of the Treasury used that tactic successfully. That's a tactic. If you really disagree with the policy and fundamentally disagree and think it's bad for the country, you go in and you tell the president so. There's a great reluctance to do this on the part of these people. Tremendous reluctance on the part of Condi Rice. She was just out of her element, in my view.
I was going to ask you about that next. Where was Dr. Rice in all of this?
My theory, and what I saw, was that she had a decision to make, and she knew it. She wanted to be Secretary of State. She knew that if she was going to be Secretary of State, Powell had made it clear to the president and to her that he served one term. She knew if she was going to follow him, she needed the president's imprimatur. She had to have the president wanting her. So she had a choice. She could distance herself from the president by constantly fighting Rumsfeld and Cheney, usually in front of the president, or she could more or less agree with them, get closer and closer to the president, and thereby assure herself of the secretariat in the second term. I think she chose the latter. Now, I have to say she was tremendously disregarded by the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense, and ultimately, too, by Powell, because he realized that the process was dysfunctional. Rich came into my office one day and he said, Chief, this is the most dysfunctional NSC in the history of the Republic. And I said, d'accord, I agree. What do we do about it? And he sort of shrugged his shoulders and left. And I knew what we were going to do. We were going to start in running too. Everybody else was in running, so we'd start in running too. And Powell sought the president on Air Force One and a trip to Africa. He sought the president during the hour he had with him each week and didn't tell anybody else what he'd said. I mean, it became a real mess, truly dysfunctional.
Now, where were the Vulcans in all of this? Because the Vulcans had come together, they had formulated some sort of foreign policy.
I think that's, despite the book and other descriptions of them, they became, other than a core group, which I would call the essential neoconservatives, they became not so collective, particularly Rich, maybe even Paul. Paul was not the person Doug Feith was, for example. Paul Wolfowitz, yeah. Paul was, he'd always been very cerebral. He was one of our best ambassadors when I was in the Pacific and Indonesia. We had 35 ambassadors. I'd put him at the top. He really did a good job in Jakarta. But he was a very conceptual guy. He was not an administrator, which was a terrible mistake making him Deputy Secretary of Defense. Terrible mistake. Rich should have been Deputy Secretary of State. Huge mistake Powell made. Powell and Rich drank each other's Kool-Aid every day. They reinforced each other's weaknesses and failed to reinforce each other's strengths. And so if Rich had been at DOD and Paul had been in state, that would have been a much better relationship, because each of us would have had spies, as it were. We didn't. And Paul couldn't make the Defense Department run. So it fell to Rumsfeld and it fell to Feith to make it run. And they were not interested in making it run. They were interested in making it subservient to their views. So it was a really dysfunctional, I would say, I've studied every NSC, every president, every decision-making process from 47 on. And I'd say it is the most dysfunctional process. In his outcall on the president on 13 January 2005, Powell told the president, "You have the most dysfunctional decision-making process in our history." And the president looked at him and said, Powell debriefed me verbatim virtually. The president looked at him and said, "Oh, come on, you were there when Cap and when Reagan and when Schultz had these tremendous battles and everything. You were the national security advisor in the last. You know how hard they fought. You and Frank Carlucci had to pick pieces up after." And Powell let the president finish, and he said, "Mr. President, this is orders of magnitude worse." And then the president sat down and listened. And Powell filled his ears for an hour. And this was after Powell had been severely embarrassed by walking into the Oval Office and having the president say, "Mr. Secretary of State, what are you here for?" And Powell said, "My outcall." And then the president, "Andy?" He wanted one card in there to tell him why Powell was there, and he didn't know about it.
This was mentioned in a biography of
I couldn't believe it, because I'd been working with the Chief of Staff, Andy Card, and I've been working with Brian Montgomery, Deputy Chief of Staff, for almost a month on this call. It had originally been scheduled for earlier. I was in London. I get a call from the doyen of the diplomatic corps in Washington, the ambassador from Singapore, and she says, Larry, you have to get Powell to Jakarta and out to Aceh. He is the only one who can bring comfort and security to these people. We have lots of dead people out there." So I called Powell from London and I said, "Boss, I know you're going to tell me to go to Indonesia, right? Got my plane ticket." So he went to Indonesia and he stayed out there several days, and we had to delay the meeting. And that caused the whole White House personnel system and the Deputy Chief of Staff and the Chief of Staff to go, "Yeah, okay, we got to do this all over again. We need some more talking points from you on Indonesia, because that's going to be you need talking points for the president to deal with his principal cabinet officer." Anyway, I knew they knew. And yet, here he walks in, the president is not even apprised of the fact that he's having an outcall with his Secretary of State. So, and I knew Powell was angry. Powell was so angry that he actually went home for a week, and Rich came into me and said, again, he said, "Chief, what are we going to do?" I'm acting Secretary of State, but this isn't legal. The Secretary's present. And he would not come back into work. He was so angry. And finally one day I looked out there at his personal elevator, you know, and whoop, he came back. But he was furious. He was really angry.
We'll come back to that. Right now, let's move on with the East Asia part
Sure.
of it. Who did you work most closely with, at least when you were in the policy planning unit?
I worked with Evan Feigenbaum and I worked with Matt Palmer. They were the two most dynamic members. Richard had really put together a great policy planning staff. Those were 30 or so of the best people I've ever worked with in my life. And I worked with some tremendous people in the military, but these people were just top drawer. I give Richard, he had very few personnel skills, but Richard really knew how to pick people. We had some great people on that staff. And Matt and Evan were two of those guys. Evan was fluent in Mandarin. He spoke Mandarin in a way that Wang Yi asked him when we were in Beijing. Wang Yi said, "Where'd you learn your Mandarin? You sound like a street urchin." He grew up in Beijing, so he spoke it as pure Mandarin, if you will. He also spoke the street version. Good people. And Jim Kelly I'd known Jim Kelly for a long time, so I was plugged into him. I was going to his Asia informals every Monday afternoon, which include the CIA, the Vice President's office, usually Steve Yates. I think we had a DIA. We had pretty much the interagency, small interagency group meeting every Monday afternoon in Jim's office. So those are my interlocutors, if you will, over the Asia policy, East Asia policy.
Who did you work with from the NSC?
Normally I left that up to Jim. Most often, I want to say initially, oh God, I can't believe I've lost her name. She was a policy planning staff member, friend of Megawati.
Oh, Karen Brooks.
Karen Brooks, yes. Mostly I worked with Karen. Karen and Matt and I used to go to lunch all the time, and we just yak about what we were doing. Her focus was Indonesia, but she knew East Asia pretty well too. And so I basically let Jim deal with NSC staff though. I didn't want to get things out of whack. And we already had a bad situation, and I teach this, the centralization of power in the White House caused by the NSC staff expanding and so forth. You actually have ambassadors like the ambassador from China, the ambassador from India, who are going to go to the NSC staff first. Then they're going to go to DOD. Then if they have time, they're going to come to state. That's the reflection of how dramatically the centralization of power has taken place in the White House as a result of the process. And it's also an example of how much money the Defense Department has. We used to say it this way. Jim and I used to say, hey, look, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia and Pacific, when he goes to Tokyo, he carries carrier battle groups, billions of dollars, Marine amphibious groups, and so forth in his briefcase. When I go, I carry a piece of paper with nothing on it. So it's a reality. The real power's in the White House. And there's a lot of power in DOD. There's very little power at state. And foreigners recognize that.
Who did you work with from DOD on East Asia?
Most of the time, clandestinely. And most of the time, the military guy over there, I can't remember who it was now. 1-star or 2-star, I can't remember. Sometimes I would work with the civilians, but most of the time there again, I let Jim do that rather than me trying to get in the middle of it, particularly when I became Chief of Staff, because when I became Chief of Staff, Jim would be in my office generally every week, if not every day, or I'd be in his office. And that was a more efficient and less controversial, even though everybody else was doing it. I wanted to work through the people that were there. So I let Jim interface with DOD and Jim interface with the NSC staff. And Jim knew that I was close to Powell, not just because I was his Chief of Staff. I mean, even when I was in policy planning, Jim knew I was close to Powell. So he knew he had a direct conduit into the Secretary. if he didn't want to go himself in there. And sometimes that worked better. And he also knew that Powell had given me carte blanche to work on the North Korea issue. I was a member of the North Korea working group, a huge working group that was probably one of the most efficient, effective working groups I've ever been involved in with government, because we were all focused on one thing. We were focused on hurting North Korea.
So would you say then that at least in the first 9 months of the Bush administration, as far as East Asia and Southeast Asia were concerned, that there was a strong team in place?
I would, except I would qualify that thusly. The number one domestic priority was reducing taxes. The number one foreign policy priority was ballistic missile defense and abrogation of the ABM Treaty. That carried with it unilateralism. And it carried a degree of unilateralism that, just by the fact it was there, fed into many other issues and policies. And so, while you might say there was a strong team, and you might say there was a policy, a defined policy, it was very poorly executed because of these other emphases which overrode everything else. For example, Powell was taken off his focus on China by the fact that the president, the vice president leading the way, wanted to do the ABM Treaty so abruptly, and wanted to do it without consulting with Berlin, Paris, London, Moscow, anyone. And Powell had to pour himself into that breach, and had to go to all those places and assuage hard feelings and real angst about what was happening, including Moscow. That's how we got the Moscow Treaty. A little 2-page treaty, but it was a massive reduction in nuclear weapons on both sides, and went right along with non-nuclear and what we wanted to do with nuclear weapons in general, particularly with Russian nuclear weapons. So though it was a strong team and we had some policies in place, with the exception of Korea, it took us a long time to build that policy. You destroyed the agreed framework. That's what you wanted to do. And then, now we need something to replace it. Just like we did Kyoto. We destroyed Kyoto and then said, now we need something to replace it? Maybe not. We don't believe in climate change anyway. Strong team, but very poorly executed strategy, and mostly because Cheney had different views, and he wanted to get in those views. Great example was what they were trying to do with Taiwan. They tried to use Chen Shui-bian and his independence referendum to make more solid a Cold War between China and the United States. There was not hardly a month that went by that they didn't send someone, sometimes higher than the protocol called for, higher rank than the protocol called for, to Taipei to talk to National Security Advisor or to Chen Shui-bian himself, and convince him that Beijing won't do anything. It's not really a red line. You should go ahead with this independence referendum and everything. And we would send Doug Powell, our representative in AIT or Taipei, or we'd send someone from our line of work to Taipei to disabuse him of it. I mean, it was a racket, month in and month out. We found that culminated in the firing. We fired Therese Shaheen, who was Larry DeRita's wife, spokesperson for Rumsfeld at the Defense Department. When Bush was finally convinced by Powell, he had to make a public statement more or less reining in CSB. And he did. Bush made the statement. And then Therese Shaheen, who was our Taiwan representative for business in Roslyn, comes out and makes a public statement that the president didn't mean what he said. So we fired her. And we said it was medical reasons and so forth, but we fired her. Jim Kelly was adamant that she had to go. Couldn't have something like that happening. So it was tit for tat the whole 4 years, trying to keep the U.S.-China relationship on an even keel, and they trying to use Taiwan to push it off that even keel.
So the East Asia or Asian team aside, how did you get a sense of how well President Bush knew Asia or cared about Asia?
Not well, not nearly like his father did. But like I said, I think he had this intuitive grasp of what it meant to the economy. And so he gave Powell his head, more or less. This was really apparent in April of 2001 when the F-8 and the EP-3 collided. As I recall, and you could check this with Rich or Powell because they would know, of course, but as I recall, Powell came in, he came into Rich's office and said something about, where are they? And they found out that they were traveling. The Chinese leadership was traveling in South America, as I recall. And Powell had Chen Shih-Chen's cell phone number. So by cell phone, Powell is able to get the person in China who probably knows more about the United States than anyone else to talk to the leadership and to say, we need to solve this crisis. And so Powell takes over immediately, and they begin to solve the crisis. It included sending Admiral Brewer, whom the Chinese had some respect for, back to China to kind of be the interlocutor. I remember vividly Powell telling me, too, that he had informed Condi, who had informed Rumsfeld, that were he to send a significantly high-ranking person to China, he could get the EP3 back intact. He sent a lieutenant, a flag lieutenant, I think, from the Navy. And so the Chinese cut the plane up and shipped it back COD. Anyway, Powell handled that crisis, and I began to wonder, as did Richard, why was Powell given his head here? Why did we get the communique we did? Why did we solve that crisis? Did we tamp it down and everything so easily? And we're having so much problem with the other things. And we all talked about it, and then we came to the conclusion that, and I think Richard's conversations with Condi bore this out, the president understood how important, the most important portfolio in U.S. international relations was the U.S.-China relationship, and better keep it calm. And Powell was doing that. At the same time, Karl Rove was whispering in the president's ear, and I know this positively, I documented it in my manuscript, that the most likely and most dangerous political opponent he would have in 2004 would be Powell. And so the president had that to deal with too, that his most competent cabinet officer with respect to China, and a man he depended on with respect to China, was maybe his foremost opponent in 2004, which was bull, total bull. Powell had no desire to run for president. But you know how that goes. I mean, you can't convince a sitting president that one of his cabinet officers might be his worst opponent.
So when 9/11 happened, September 11th, 2001, where were you?
I was coming back from a morning breakfast where I had spoken on the knowledge generation. It was an initiative within the State Department. Actually, it came from the White House, and we were implementing it for the State Department. It had to do with technology and information and so forth. And I was getting out of the taxi, bright, beautiful day, early morning, and all of a sudden the radio in the taxi said something about a plane hitting a tower in New York. And I leaned back into the taxi and I said, "Turn the radio up, please." And he said, "Okay." And we listened to the news report. And I remember thinking out in front of the Harry Truman building, God, I wonder how that could be. It's got to be a terrorist attack. And then over across the river, I see the black smoke billowing up. And my immediate thought was, oh my God, the Pentagon's been hit too. And I ran inside, and of course, everybody was already kind of in tumult, trying to figure out what to do. And then within minutes, we were evacuating the State Department because the word had come down we were going to get hit. We were only about 10 seconds from the 3-6 takeoff from Reagan National. I could look out my office and see the planes coming, you know. So it was a scary moment. We evacuated in accordance with plans. We stood around in our designated areas, hearing all manner of rumors. Bomb on D Street, car exploded downtown on 16th Avenue, that sort of thing. And then the all clear sort of was sounded. And we started to come back in the building, and then the White House ordered the evacuation of Washington not by any plan, just normal go home. And so the secretary let it be known throughout the building that other than emergency needed personnel, everyone should go home. I think the White House made that decision because they knew if there were further attacks, and they did expect them, they couldn't evacuate Washington in an orderly way. So best to just let everybody go home in that kind of orderly way. That's what we did. But many of us came back later in the day, including Richard Haas and some of the policy planning staff, and we began to put together what we called our strategy for how to react to that.
And what was that?
It was really kind of unique in the sense that I remember someone bringing up Le Monde and what the headline would be, I think, the next day, which said, "We're all Americans now," and talking about how it was a moment of global solidarity that we should exploit. And they didn't mean it in a pejorative sense. We talked about how we might meet now a lot of objectives we had, policy objectives we had, who might carry that out primarily, where and with what tools, under this new umbrella of international solidarity. And it included everything from what we knew was coming, force in Afghanistan, or probably force. We wanted to try diplomacy first, but force. And things like better relations and better policies in Uzbekistan. I mean, and Pakistan and other places. I mean, Rich was put in charge immediately of calling the head of the ISI, and I think the president actually called Musharraf. I know Powell did. So the matrix we created was sort of objectives, countries to carry out those objectives, or whom we need to fulfill these tasks, policy tasks, and people to do it primarily. Was it the ambassador in Copenhagen, for example? Was it the president of Pakistan? Who was going to deal with him? The Secretary of State, the president himself, and so forth. And we created this matrix that said, this is how we're going to get a lot of things done in this moment of global solidarity, including what you want to do, Mr. President, with regard to the immediate attacks, getting rid of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And I think it's fair to say we thought there was a remote chance we could get a government we'd been dealing with, that we recognized, the Taliban, in Afghanistan, to surrender bin Laden and most of his lieutenants who might have been responsible for 9/11. We thought there was at least a hair of a chance we could get them to do it under force of threat, maybe some, favors, but get them to surrender them and continue what had been the policy since earlier than Reagan, but certainly with Reagan, he really put it in place, law enforcement, not war, law enforcement, because we knew changing from law enforcement, we did two dramatic things. One, we brought the law of war into play. God, we went well beyond that, but we knew that that was very enabling of executive power and could go on forever. And we were scared of that. And two, we knew that it made the Taliban and Al-Qaeda warriors. And we thought they should be continued to be treated as criminals. We didn't want to give them warrior status, certainly not within Islam. We did not want to give them warrior status. So we thought we might be able to achieve Al-Qaeda and Taliban diminishment through diplomacy. That went away quickly when we saw how adamant I think at the Camp David meeting, Secretary saw how adamant the president was and how adamant everyone else was that we had to use the war instrument.
Mm-hmm. So that strategy or matrix that you talked about, how much of that were you actually able to put in place?
We thought we put the whole thing in place, and we did pieces. But I think it's fair to say we were still beavering away on that strategy, we being state in particular, but the interagency in general, until Iraq. And Iraq just put it all in a cocked hat. I mean, we realized Iraq had reversed everything, most prominently with the transatlantic relationship. England was the only one with us. And Tony Blair, while looking like he was an eager partner, from time to time looked like he might be as reluctant as some of the others, and he was just doing it to preserve the special relationship. I'm not sure that's a correct assessment now after doing more research, but at the time, he looked like a reluctant warrior.
Now, you said that even back in August 2001, Richard Haas already
Mm-hmm.
thought that the country might be going to war in Iraq.
Yeah.
So when 9/11 happened, did you get a sense that, oh my goodness, well, I guess this is it?
I did get the sense that if we were not careful, there were people who would exploit this, both domestically, politically. Karl Rove was saying things, Ken Mehlman was saying things like, we can be in power forever now if we exploit this right. I did get the feeling that that was probably an insidious development with regard to 9/11 domestically. Unless, to a lesser extent, but still to an extent, I got the feeling that there were people who were going to exploit it for other reasons internationally. And I got that from things like Rumsfeld immediately want to reintroduce U.S. forces into the Philippines, which Jim was a little antsy about, particularly the way Rumsfeld was talking about it initially. It wasn't just soft, it was regular forces, but it wound up being compromised and special operating forces. And I got it from sort of a reading of a briefing I went to, which was allegedly on contingency planning, which I knew a lot about, having been a planner for CINPAC for a long time. I got a briefing that made me think we were contingency planning for Iraq, Syria, and Iran. And I remember asking the question of the Air Force 3-star who was doing the briefing, where is this in terms of the civilian hierarchy? Is this something you're just doing, which we did from time to time in the military when we anticipated something? Or is this something that has the blessing of the Defense Department and is going to be a fully vetted plan? You're going to tip fit it and everything else, you know? Or is this just conceptual planning? Or where is this? I didn't get an answer, not a good answer anyway. But that gave me an indication that there were some people in the Defense Department who were thinking about a series of attacks, a series of wars, if you will, that would more or less, and this came to my mind immediately, eliminate the enemies of Israel. And I started thinking about Doug Feith and Paul Wolfowitz. Paul I'd known a long time, and wondering if there was anything to this business of, we got a whole new policy with respect to Israel, and it's destroying her enemies. Because I knew the Bush administration had said its policy with respect to the Middle East was going to be something like this. Nothing's worked. Reagan, HW, they tried everything. We got Oslo going, nothing. Madrid, nothing. Nothing's worked. So let's ignore it. Let's just ignore it. Only they didn't just ignore it. They grew very close to Likud, to Arik Sharon, and Bush actually made those impolitic remarks about Sharon being a man of peace, which just roused the Palestinians and the Arabs in general. Powell had to make some phone calls and so forth. So it really concerned me when I saw this, war planning going on. And I thought, gee, crickets, it's not just Iraq, it's the whole panoply of people who don't like Israel or who might mount armed forces against Israel. That turned out to be, I think, more true than I thought at the time. And the only thing that derailed it was abysmal failure in Iraq.
So did that just suck all the oxygen out of the room?
It
where
did.
Where did Asia fit into any of this?
It sucked a total. There was only once Tommy Franks was told to do planning for Iraq in November of 2001. The air began to go out. The oxygen began to leave for any other issue. Powell was furious that they hadn't finished Afghanistan. His major objections to the president over doing Iraq were, one, that it would absolutely take the focus off Afghanistan. See, we knew what we'd done in the H.W. Bush administration. We had cut the military to the point to pay back the peace dividend, to the point where we could only do, and that very, very carefully and with a great deal of risk, two major contingencies simultaneously. Clinton came in with Aspen and did his plan, implemented his plan B, which took us down another, we'd cut 25%. That took us down another 3 to 5%. We knew then we could not do two major contingencies simultaneously, so Aspen began talking about it, and Powell too, he was, his subordinate, near simultaneously. And we talked about hold and win. We'd hold in one, win in the other, and then transfer forces and win that one. Military knew that was hogwash. There's no way you can do that. You can't hold in North Korea or hold in Iraq, win in North Korea, and then come and win in Iraq too. But we went along with our civilian bosses. That's what we had to do. So Powell's looking at this and saying, you can't do them both. I know, you can't do them both. And so we took our eye off Afghanistan. It became an economy of force mission, very few forces, and we put everything into Iraq. From that moment on, building to March of 2003, all the energy was on that. And some of the energy was being expended to try and stop it, or at least put it off. Because Powell's second objection was, you don't have legitimacy, and you want that. You want that, so you need to wait.
How did China react to that?
It seemed like they were very happy to have gotten the accord they got with regard to principally the Uyghurs on counterterrorism efforts, because theretofore we had been feebly protesting their persecution of the Uyghurs. And suddenly we quit doing that. We agreed that if they gave us cooperation in the war on terror, that we would, be more mild in our criticism of them, and they could pursue their own war of terror. So that was the kind of tacit bargain that was made, and China remained fairly quiescent during this. I don't think they were happy about the invasion of Iraq because they didn't see it. First, they saw it as a violation of UN protocol. You don't do that sort of thing. It was illegal. And second, they saw it as disruptive of the region, and they were growing increasingly concerned about their ability to get very highly priced oil and gas out of the region.
What about Japan?
Japan has this penchant for Republican governments and distaste for democratic governments, or at least the Japan I'm familiar with, the more conservative elements. I think Japan was uneasy, but Japan was, it's a Republican government. They must be right. But I think I know there was some unease.
What about the Muslim countries farther south? Southeast Asia, that is.
We got some good advice from Jakarta. I thought it was good advice. We got some good advice from Lee Kuan Yew.
What did they say?
Be careful. You're going to punch a hornet's nest. And I'm not sure you know what you're doing. Do you have a strategy for the aftermath? What are you going to do? Do you realize you're destroying the balance of power in the Gulf, a balance of power you've tried to maintain for years and years and years rather successfully? What are you going to do afterwards? What's going to be the balancer? Are you going to stay forever? Those sorts of things. There was a lot of disquiet over it. Didn't think we knew what we were doing. They were right.
And did Jakarta give similar advice?
I think, if I remember what Jim said about discussions there, it was more along the lines of the Muslim community is not Al-Qaeda. The Muslim community is not Jamaat Islamiyah. There are 1.6 billion Muslims, or 1.3, I think was the figure we were using then. And most of them are peaceful and don't have anything to do. The problem with that formulation, though, was that we had a briefing at the CIA. I believe Jim was with me when I went to this briefing. Young lady who was really brilliant, fluent in Arabic, fluent in Farsi. And she gave us a 3-hour briefing on that Muslim community. And I remember the chart she used. Here was the 1.3, and then here was another group, and here's another group, here's another group. And counterintuitively, the base, Al-Qaeda, was at the top. And she showed how money poured from the base to the top, and how it was filtered through different groups as it went up there. But she convinced us that of that 1.3 billion Muslim community, probably 50% were contributing to Al-Qaeda in one way or another. Many of them unknowingly, but they were doing it. And her point, of course, to George Tenet was that we need to somehow get into this finance, and we need to make people knowledgeable and thus stop where we can and cut it off where we can, even maybe kill some of the couriers who are carrying this money around. That briefing told me that we had a bigger problem than we thought we did with this larger Muslim community. Even if it was largely unwitting when it was doing this, it nonetheless was fueling groups like Al-Qaeda. And then the other part of the briefing that was very disturbing was the polling that had been done. Polling done by other countries as well as us that demonstrated that there was a lot of sympathy for Al-Qaeda in a wider group than perhaps we thought or were being told by clerics and others, even by people in Jakarta and elsewhere. And so I think it's fair to say we had an ambiguous view about that. We really didn't know how much of that Muslim community was on our side, and it scared us, frankly, because that's a lot of people.
Why do you think there was so much sympathy for Al-Qaeda?
You know, I'm going to give you a straight answer. U.S. policy towards Israel. That was my reading of it. That was the number one reason. U.S. policy in general in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. But basically, if you really scratched the imbalance in our treatment of the Israelis versus the Palestinians and the Arabs in general, and to a certain extent, our alliance with Saudi Arabia, because most of those Muslims saw the Saudis as, you know, anathema. That's terrible.
How much of a role did the Bush presidency up to that point play, you think, in this?
We made some real bad remarks in the start, you know, using terms like crusade and the war instrument itself. And when he held that cabinet meeting with all the press present and everything, he said it was an act of war. And we're going to answer with an act of war, and several acts of war and so forth. I don't think that went down very well with that community. And they saw it again as an imbalance. I remember one conversation I had with an Indonesian. It was about, why aren't we doing anything in North Korea when we're doing something there? And the answer was Israel and oil. I mean, that was the answer. North Korea we saw as a bigger threat than Iran, for example, but we were concentrating on Iraq and Iran and that sort of thing. We weren't concentrating on North Korea except perfunctorily, and it was because there was no Israel and no oil in Northeast Asia.
President Bush also declared a global war on terror.
Terrible use of terms. We had a big discussion about how do you make war an instrument or a policy? I mean, how do you do that? You were making war on Al-Qaeda, Jamaat Islamiyah, Lashkar-e-Taiba, whatever. You're not making war on terrorism, but you know, you use the rhetoric your speechwriters give you.
Given that
axis of evil, that came from the speechwriters. It came from the speechwriters. And to my boss's eternal discredit, we didn't get to see many of the speeches. He got to see that speech and he didn't catch it, and he didn't pass it around.
So once the focus started on the war in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, how did Southeast Asia or East Asia fit into that picture, into that big picture?
Only, I think, from what I saw, in terms of where we could gain advantage. For example, as I said, in the Philippines, money from the Japanese, maybe some help from the South Koreans, but mostly help just in terms of the policy we were trying to implement with the Koreans, which was sort of twofold. It was, don't take your eye off North Korea, but we want to stay here after reunification if it happens, and we want to stay here anyway because we want you to be now regionally oriented with our forces as sort of a backup to it, and we want you to bless whatever we do with our forces that happen to be coming from the peninsula. And oh, by the way, we don't want you to be so focused globally, because that's where the Koreans, the government at the time, talked about, the MOD and others talked about Korea being a global power, an international player. And we were a little bit alarmed about that prospect, though at the same time we were trying to get the Koreans to participate more robustly in UN operations and so forth and so on. So again, it's, you know, we got all these things going, some of which are antithetical to one another. And but I think it's fair to say that we didn't see, other than what was happening in the Philippines and perhaps what was happening in Indonesia, and had some spillover with Jamaat Islamiyah as the real targets. They were part of the game, but they weren't the real targets. The real target, initially at least, was Al-Qaeda and their host, the Taliban. That the other spread of the global war on terror, to me, was opportunistic. It was to get other things to happen. On our part, it was to get other, I think, good things to happen. On DOD's part, it was to get other things to happen that maybe we might have disagreed with.
Talk a little bit more about these other things.
Well, we were really uneasy to a certain extent. I don't think Jim was, initially at least, but some of us were uneasy about this massive effort to get back with the Indonesians. Yes, there was a whole generation of Indonesian military who didn't know anything about the United States, really had a distaste for the United States and its policies, perhaps leadership even that had distaste for it. And that distaste percolated up into the civilian leadership too. But I was a little bit uneasy about re-energizing everything that we'd had before quickly, and because I didn't see that as being all that positive. Jim, on the other hand, I think saw it as being an initiative that should be pursued and fulfilled. So there was some contention there. I don't think the vice president's office, which ultimately was the arbiter, gave a damn. And so Jim sort of had his head there. If they'd been asked, they probably would have said, yeah, we need the Indonesian armed forces on our side. I don't care what they're doing in Aceh. I don't care what's happening in East Timor or whatever. That's all tempest in a teapot. We want them back. And we had some interesting dialogue with the Australians about that too, because I watched as Australia essentially shifted from thinking the Indonesians were the greatest threat they had and building their policy more or less to meet that threat, to considering themselves more internationally focused and beginning to focus on China and not having any idea which way they were going to go. That is to say, accommodation or stand up to them. And I'm not sure that during my tenure, the Australians made a decision on that. I think they've made a decision now, accommodation, basically, with a little hedging. But that perturbated things with Indonesia too, was this relationship with Australia. And frankly, generally speaking, though, I just think all the energy was being sucked out increasingly by the Middle East. And so everything else was kind of on the back boiler and left to the assistant secretaries. And Jim got some of the things he wanted and didn't get some of the things he wanted. That too was majorly perturbated by the North Korean issue. It became a real focus. When Jim went to Pyongyang in October, I think it was 2002, and confronted Yi-gun and Kang Sak-ju, it was, first of all, we had this tremendous debate in my office with the translator Jim took with him, and with the actual wording. I think it was Kang Sak-ju. Had they actually said, yes, we do have a highly enriched uranium program and it's progressing well, we're going to make a bomb or two. Or had they equivocated? And we had one translator saying one thing, and he happened to be the translator that the North Koreans had brought in, had his transcript. And we had our translator, whom I remember as Jack Pritchard, I believe, saying another thing. So we weren't certain precisely what the North Koreans had said, but we knew two things. We knew the agreed framework was dead, for no other reason than Bush wanted it dead, Cheney wanted it dead. And two, we had no policy except what we thought we were developing, which was to go at them with so much opportunity that they dare not refuse it. It didn't include things like the agreed framework. It included more robust ideas, like we would actually hook the South Korean grid up to the North Korean grid. We'd figure out a way to do that, billions of dollars, because they're very different grids. Because we knew the number one concern on Pyongyang's part was power. They didn't have power. We had people coming back from North Korea and reporting to us how desperately ancient their power system was, and it was just falling apart. So they desperately wanted those light water reactors. So we were still trying to forge that policy in the wake of the revelations in Pyongyang. At the same time, I think Cheney was saying, we don't speak to evil with North Korea either, screw them. You know? And so it was very hard to even craft the multi-party talks in that policy environment. We did it, but we did it in a way that was, as I said, put Jim in a straitjacket. So what progress could we make? I mean, it was an apparatus. It looked multilateral. It looked like policy, but it was really not much.
So was there even a grand strategy at all, or was it just sort of piecemeal policy,
Inbox, your inbox, the crisis of the day. And the president and the vice president had prescribed the major crisis. It was Iraq. 9/11 had prescribed the other, and the excuse for Iraq.
What about the NSC strategy that came out in 2002? Did that mean anything?
Again, my boss didn't think it was very bold, and I said, "My God, we're authorizing preemptive war. Not even preemptive war. It's war that we decide 2 years in advance of the threat materializing or whatever." That's what we'd done before. It's what the Vulcans had talked about. It's this robust unilateralism that essentially says if anybody rises up that even barely looks like they might be a threat, we're going to smack them. You understand that, world? Once you understand that, we won't have to smack too many people, because we'll smack a couple and make examples, which I think was one of the primary reasons for Iraq. One of the primary motivations for Iraq was to smack them and let everybody see it, which didn't go down very well with me, because I thought, man, you're smacking low-hanging fruit. You're smacking fruit that we smacked in 1990-91 that obviously is, not capable of even smacking back. This is not a real smack, and the world knows it. So why are we doing this? But we went ahead. I mean,
did you have any part to play in contributing to that strategy?
Not really. Powell asked me to craft a national strategy when we first went in. I started on it. I handed him a draft early on. I shouldn't say this probably, but I don't think I went through Richard. I think I gave it straight to Powell. Richard didn't even know I was doing it. And Powell said, he didn't even read it. He handed it back to me and he said, fait accompli, Condi's already contracted it out. I said, what? Contracted it out? Yeah, there's some Beltway bandit writing it. They tried to write it in the NSC and they couldn't produce a product she liked, so they gave it to some Beltway bandit. And I knew how he had, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he had just cut Beltway bandits out of the loop. He told the 2,400 members of the Joint Staff, you are going to do the work, not these assholes in the Beltway. And he cut almost all the contracts. So he was not a guy who liked that kind of stuff. And so I said, contracted it out? He said, yeah. And now,
who are these Beltway bandits? Are you referring to think tanks or?
Different people, SAIC, CSIS, you name it. I mean, I don't know who actually did that. I heard rumors it was a group in CSIS, but I don't know who did it. At any rate, we got the first draft and circulated it around, made our input and so forth. And then it came out and it had that section in there, section 5 or whatever it was called. And we all thought, those of us who thought that it was a little bit bold, a little bit too much. And
that became known as the Bush Doctrine.
Yeah, it became known as the Bush Doctrine. But I think to a certain extent, Powell later kind of caveated his feelings by saying something to the extent of, well, it's what we've always done, really. It just got put down on paper. And so what? It was unclassified on paper. So what? We just, put down on paper what we did normally. And so what's bad about that? And some of that was trying to expiate himself, I think, for having let it pass through. But to a certain extent, he was right, too. I mean, it was kind of H.W. Bush, too, but it was much better articulated, and it was more, it tripped off his tongue better, even though, he got tongue-tied sometimes. Bush knew how to implement it. His son didn't. And if you're going to be unilateral, you need to be unilateral in a way that seems to be accommodating, coordinating, and corroborating with your allies, at least. Bush was intent on reunifying Germany and leaving it in NATO, but he went to everybody to get it done. He didn't just try to force it. Even Cole was concerned because it was going to cost so much money. They were predicting $60 to $80 billion equivalent at that time. So he had to do a lot of convincing, but he was he was going to do it. He was, even if Germany didn't want to do it, he was going to do it. And that's the way we were most of the time. My experience, we were going to get it done. But you talk to people, you didn't just force it down their throat.
So did Colin Powell or Richard Haas, for that matter, or you yourself sort of realize how that sort of rhetoric might have repercussions?
Yes, Richard definitely did. Richard would constantly come in with this crestfallen look on his face, some other pronouncement we'd made. The ABM Treaty, Kyoto started it off, the ABM Treaty, there was something with Germany. I can't remember exactly what it was, but we had made some statements, and then those were exacerbated by Schroeder meeting in the Oval with Bush and promising Bush that though he was apprised of the fact we were probably going to Iraq, in spite of his objections to anything like that, he would not exploit it in his campaign to win a second term. Went right back to Germany and exploited it. And Bush said, Schroeder, and relations with Germany just went down the tube. And Powell, I told Powell one night about midnight when we were drinking Joschka Fischer's beer. It was in his refrigerator. Joschka would bring him beer, and Powell would give Joschka cooking utensils because Joschka liked to cook. He was sort of a gourmet and fancied himself a chef. And I told Powell, I said, you know what you and Joschka are doing is holding hands under the table and thereby preserving the U.S.-German relationship, and in some respects, a transatlantic relationship. And he said, yeah, you're probably right, because Bush and Schroeder wouldn't even talk to each other. So, there were some real problems. And what we became, I wrote a memo for Powell in early 2004, and I handed it to him and walked back out of his office. I said, read this, boss, when you have time. And a few minutes later, we had adjoining offices. A few minutes later, I knocked on his door. He didn't knock on mine. He just came through the door and he handed it to me. And he said, I think it's better than that, and went back in his office. Well, it was a one-page memo, and what it did was it said, the United States Navy has not lost a warship since World War II. The reason it has not lost one, even though we've had one hit by 2 Exocet missiles from Iraq, we've had one hit a mine in the Persian Gulf, we've had one attacked by Al-Qaeda in Yemen, we have not lost them because we have extraordinary damage control. We have courageous, well-trained sailors who know how to do damage control and know how to save the ship. That is what you've been doing for 3.5 years. And later he would tell me, remember that memo? And I'd say, you mean the one about your damage control? Yes. Well, what I've been doing is cleaning the dog shit off the Oval Office carpet. So he kind of bought into what I said. That's what we were doing. We were doing damage control. Once we figured out what was going on, and it took us a while, we were doing damage control. And I've told people, you would not have wanted to see that first administration without Colin Powell. It would have been much worse. And people have said, worse?
So back to the NSS 2002, there was also talk in there, of course, about democracy building, which, when Bush first came in, he said, I don't do nation building. And suddenly it seemed like a quick turnaround. Did that surprise you?
It did to a certain extent, because I knew that what he'd said in South Carolina, I knew what he'd campaigned on, and I'd studied all that to write Powell's confirmation testimony. A balance of power that favors freedom. That was his favorite phrase. And I put that in Powell's confirmation testimony. So it came as a surprise to me. I knew Rumsfeld was opposed to it, adamantly opposed to it. He'd said so. So it was a surprise to me, and the only single individual I could attribute it to was Condi, because she had that strain in her, that human right, that sort of, not like Samantha Power or even Susan Rice, but Samantha Power is consumed by it. But she did have that strain that the United States had a responsibility, messianic responsibility, to spread democracy in the world. And she's the one who convinced the president, for example, that she should give that speech wherein she essentially said, we've been too close to these dictators, implying Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and other places, and we need to break away. We need a new policy and so forth and so on. I think the rest of the administration was going, stay away from that, but let her do it anyway. But I can only pinpoint her as the person who probably brought that to the president's compassionate conservatism angle. And he had that very much in him, because Powell he was not amazed, but I think he was somewhat surprised. He'd known the president in Texas. He'd worked with him with America's Promise in Texas. But I do think he was somewhat surprised when he asked the president for the billions he did for the Global UN AIDS Fund and for the U.S. Fund for AIDS in Africa. And he got it. He not only got it, he got the president's slap on the back acquiescence, and I think I'll go to Africa. I should go there, and I should let them know that I care, and so forth. And one of the only places where George Bush is beloved, I think, is Africa. So he had that streak. He had that streak where he wanted to help, and he wanted to do so definitively. So I don't think that was hard for Condi to get him to think in those terms, and it became a policy initiative.
Now, I think it set up alarm bells.
Cheney and Rumsfeld, they wanted nothing to do with it. Nothing to do. They thought it was impractical, costly, and would get us in more trouble than anything else. Rumsfeld wanted, I'll give it to Don. His plan was to go to Iraq and be out in 4 to 6 months, to unseat Hussein and come out. And damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, don't care what replaces him. What replaces him's got to be better than him. I mean, that's kind of the attitude they had. That's how Larry DeRita was briefing our troops, even from his public affairs position in Kuwait, right before the invasion. Charles Hughes and General the Orha guy, Garner, later would say that on camera, that they had been told that we were in and out, and so there was no plan to stay, no plan to occupy, no plan to build, institutionalize, anything like that. We were going to go in and get out. I'm told that Tenet and Rumsfeld had sort of the same idea about Afghanistan, but neither George nor Dunn has said anything enough for me to, that we should go in, bash Al-Qaeda, bash the Taliban, leave, and on the way out tell them, do it again, and we'll come back and do it again. Which, in retrospect, probably would have been, if we were going to do it, better than lingering and costing all the treasure and blood that it did on both sides.
Well, Aaron, I think, is going to speak to you more about that in a little bit. I want to get back to the NSS of 2002. So, talk of democracy building, talk of preemptive war, that set off alarm bells all over the place, including in Asia. Mm-hmm. What was your sense of the reaction from individual governments out there? Again,
we were still getting expressions of concern and anxiety about overextension, about you Republicans are supposed to be realpolitikers. You're not supposed to be these bleeding heart liberals who see every problem in the world and think a bomb will help. This is of some concern to us. And I think we saw some countries who were very concerned about the unilateral aspects of what it forecast and what they were actually seeing with regard to Iraq, and what that meant for the United Nations and the Security Council in particular. China expressed its angst over that a number of times. Shui Tenkai and Wang Yi's talking points with us, for example, in policy planning, when we did policy planning talks, both in Beijing and Washington, became not just Taiwan, but that too. This is not respect for the United Nations. You're negating the whole purpose of the United Nations. We believe in that. We also believe in the sovereignty of states. You shouldn't be violating that sovereignty without, due process, so to speak. There was some of it was pro forma, but some of it was genuine. I think they really were concerned. They were next, maybe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how did the Philippines react, for instance, when there was talk about sending in troops?
My reading of it, I wasn't focused on the Philippines, but my reading of it from the Asia informals was they had no problem as long as they could co-opt those troops against the Moro Liberation Front or Abu Sayyaf itself, which was really a bunch of thugs capturing people for ransom and so forth. And I think we managed to convince them with probably some really specious intelligence that Al-Qaeda did have links with both groups, and that both groups had links with Al-Qaeda. It went two ways. And that probably scared them enough to where, a small presence that they could co-opt to use in their own ways too, would be okay. And so they went along with it. But I think there was some angst there too, from what Jim told me, about the giant going off and doing things that probably weren't conducive to its health, or to their health for that matter. Anything that detracted from. There was a growing realization in Manila that the real bugaboo for them, as well as the real helpmate for them economically and trade-wise, was China. And they didn't know quite how to deal with that yet. And I think some of that's, coming to fruition now as you see the Chinese building these atoll airstrips and so forth in the South China Sea, and being rather adamant about their right to do so.
So the U.S., though, had an understanding then that the Moros and the separatists out there weren't necessarily.
Oh, we wanted to help, but we wanted to be back in the Philippines, really. We wanted to get boots on the ground back in the Philippines.
But do we know there was actually a connection between them and Al-Qaeda?
I never saw any intelligence that guaranteed it. I saw some speculation, but I never saw anything that guaranteed it. The speculation would be something like this particular individual, name would be in the president's daily brief, had this telephone conversation monitored by the NSA with this person in Yemen who we know is blah, 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 blah.
Al-Qaeda aside, though, do we think that there were, in fact, Muslim terrorists, perhaps, of a Southeast Asian version?
I think we thought, and with some degree of proof, that Jemaah Islamiyah had Al-Qaeda contacts and vice versa, that they were working together. That Al-Qaeda was, Zawahiri in particular, was playing with the idea of surrogates that would not necessarily be identified as Al-Qaeda, but would be logistically and financially supported for various projects by Al-Qaeda, and they would be all over the globe.
What about Megawati and her government? Do they welcome U.S. attention in that regard?
I think they welcomed, as did many governments, the monetary support that came along with, through other channels perhaps, than counterterrorism. Some of it directly, though, for counterterrorism efforts because of this effort. They would use that money for the purposes they thought best, not necessarily for counterterrorism. I think in the case of Jakarta, though, initially at least, there was some of that support that was actually turned towards not just dissidents in Aceh, but towards Jemaah Islamiyah and towards trying to help with the problem of terrorism that might ultimately be connected with Al-Qaeda.
Was it difficult working with the Indonesian government? They were probably conflicted about.
Yeah, it was difficult for the reason you might surmise, that Islam is intrinsic, and they can't be seen as taking forceful steps against Islam that might be interpreted wrong by the community. At the same time, I would say, as Lee Kuan Yew did repeatedly, that they had a more sophisticated Muslim community than some of the, he called them street Muslims versus jungle Muslims. typical Lee Kuan Yew, very direct. But it was a more sophisticated audience, if you will. And so you could appeal to their intelligence. You could appeal to their ability to reason the difference between our efforts to fight the radicals and our feeling about Islam in general. But I think there was concern in Jakarta about that they would be perceived as helping an anti-Islamic state.
How did you get around that?
By talking as much as we could and trying to convince them that we weren't focused on Islam, we were focused on radical elements that happened to be within Islam. And we're using Islam as, ideological camouflage, if you will, to really do some dastardly things.
Now, in 2003, 2004, Abu Ghraib became public knowledge.
Disaster.
How did that affect our approach, in Asia specifically?
The Chinese immediately put at the top of their talking points, "Don't lecture us on human rights anymore, you bastards." I mean, that became, that's Taiwan, don't lecture us anymore, or don't lecture us anymore, Taiwan. Yeah, it damaged our reputation all across the globe. With some, it was opportunistic criticism, Chinese opportunistic. Hey, there's another thing we can flail the Americans with. With others, it was genuine angst. The French, the Germans, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Japanese. It was genuine concern over the country that had led the human rights movement, had indeed led the approach to the ICAT in the UN, suddenly becoming under duress that they didn't understand because, most of them had been dealing with terrorism for a long time. And all of a sudden we're murdering people, killing people, invading countries and torturing people, and secret prisons and rendition and everything. I had a Londoner tell me, I know you guys are beastly. I know you can be brutal, but I never dreamt this. That pretty much sums it up. And of course, my reaction to him was, you were complicit. Did you know that? He's, who do you mean? You were complicit.
Now, there was a black site in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it came out in the report
Yeah.
End of last year that the first black site was in Thailand. Did you know about that?
I knew rumors of it. I'm not even sure the secretary knew about it in terms of, I know where it is and I know what they're doing there. I think we had more, I know we had more firmer inkling, if you will, the one in Poland. And then we had increasing vision into Guantanamo, which was really scary. So Thailand, Poland, Guantanamo, maybe one or two other places that we were being hinted to about. Here's another problem I'm having with my book. I have no idea how much the secretary knew about this. He did not confide any of it to me, which would have been unusual, but not impossible. I once was shown a transcript by an ABC investigative team in New York City. How they got the transcript, I have no idea, but that it was genuine, I believe. And it was a transcript of a principals meeting into which the president came, which sometimes happens. And Powell was there, Tenet was there, Condi was there, the vice president was there, Rumsfeld was there, and the president came in for a time at least. And they were talking directly about torture. And my boss was there and is even on the transcript. It was clear from the transcript that the purpose of the meeting was to assuage the fears George Tenet had of prosecution in the future. And so the conversation was about how much further can I go? What can I do? Do I have legal cover? And so forth and so on. It was almost like a Tom Clancy book. You expect at any moment Tenet to say, put that in writing and hand it to me, Mr. President, after you've signed it. And so that really got me thinking about, what did my boss know and what did he not know? I don't know, and he will not tell me. But I do know the president knew. I do know the vice president probably commissioned a lot of it. I know David Addington was behind, and Bill Haynes in the Defense Department were behind OLC in writing the legal position. I know that legal position was developed after the torture started, not before. And I know that Rumsfeld and the CIA were in acute competition as to who could do it best. Rumsfeld through mainly Guantanamo, and Tenet through his secret sites and so forth. They were in competition to see who could get the most intelligence. And I also know that the intelligence the effort shifted from detecting another attack quite early to building a portfolio on the contacts between Al-Qaeda and Baghdad in order to support the Iraq War. Now, all of those things are heinous in my mind, but I've found them out. They're going to be in my book.
You were, of course, part of the team that helped. I think you spearheaded the team that helped Secretary Powell before he made his speech to the UN.
Yes. Wrote out my resignation and failed to submit it, and I wish I had. But I didn't write it out because I thought I was going to be doing something that would ultimately turn out to be a lie. I wrote it out because he had done that to me too many times, given me an impossible mission at the last minute with very few resources. And I was just sick and tired of it. So I called my wife and I said, I'm quitting, I'm leaving. And she said, why don't you come home? And I went home, and I'd already typed my resignation out, put it in my center desk drawer. And she essentially convinced me that I couldn't desert him then. I shouldn't, he was under duress and I didn't need to retreat. And so I changed my mind and went back. I kept that resignation letter in my desk drawer and took it out a number of times, especially around Abu Ghraib. And I wish, my greatest regret in life is that I didn't submit it.
You stayed on for a couple more years.
I stayed on until January 2005 and left.
I've spoken to a couple of ambassadors from Asian countries, and one of their criticisms of U.S. policy during Bush 1 was that there was so much focus on counterterrorism. They felt that all the other issues that really mattered to them, were just shoved under the table. Do you think that's fair?
I think it is fair, and I think it had two real motivators. One was domestic, and one was international. The domestic one was what Karl Rove summed up in my earshot one day, that the Republicans could hold the House, the Senate, and the White House, win if they weren't already in control, and be in control for a generation if they just played this right. And what he meant by playing it right was continuing to scare the American people to the extent that they couldn't turn Republicans loose. That was the domestic motivation. The international motivation was we can implement this strategy, and we can implement it in the shadow of 9/11. We can call it the war on terror, but what we're really doing is implementing this strategy. We're showing everyone that if they show any inclination to threaten us, we're going to smash them. Those were the two motivations. And when you got a domestic and an international motivation, domestic being mostly political and power, man, that's powerful. That's really powerful. So I think the criticism is just.
There are also those who say, because of the focus on counterterrorism, the U.S. lost sight, at least a little bit, on democracy building, on supporting civil society out there, despite, what it said in the NSS.
Right.
Do you think that's true too?
I do, and I think it's continued in the Obama administration. Mostly, I think, I'm not as close to it, of course, but I've watched it, mostly due to tactical errors more than an inability to focus or an inability to get a strategy going in a particular area. And I'd change my assessment based on the last year and a half, and what I think is happening right now. I think there's secret talks going on right now, for example, with Ankara, Moscow, Tehran, Riyadh, and Washington on keeping Assad in power, political solution, then how to get rid of Assad eventually, and so forth. So I think this administration has learned, and it's doing things now that it should be doing. But yes, I do think that we de-emphasize by our very actions, human rights, democracy building, institution building, and so forth. We did not take our eye off the ball in terms of what I consider to be really, really badly planned and badly executed and even badly conceived covert operations. We tried to pull a coup off in Caracas. We tried to pull a coup off in Damascus. We did pull a coup in Kiev. This is later, of course, under Obama. We were still trying to pull a coup in Caracas, but we're doing it now through civilians mostly infiltrated by the CIA. We're doing it through institutions, for example, that Reagan created in the early 80s, like the NDI, the IRI, and so forth. But nonetheless, they are clandestine operations, and they are attempts to overthrow other governments that are antagonistic to our interests as we judge them. I saw the one we tried to do in Caracas up close, and that's about all I can say about it. But, so in that sense, that covert sense, if you judge that to be a promotion of democracy and human rights, we were still doing it. I judged it to be more commercial and people think this is crazy, but it is true. More personal. George Bush hated Hugo Chavez. And the only policy we had towards Latin America, really, despite the Bush-Mexico connections and so forth, was Plan Colombia and eradicating drugs and making the American people think we were eradicating drugs. We never got more than 10% of them. $750 million, as I recall, in the first tranche. And trying to overthrow Hugo Chavez. We ignored the rest of our hemisphere, basically. And continuing the program to support Cuban Americans in southern Florida by putting them on a jobs program where they could seemingly be, agitating against Cuba. We were really funneling money to those Cuban Americans and paying them back for their vote.
Some people have said too that because the U.S. was so focused on counterterrorism, that inadvertently we lost our primacy in East Asia. That it left a vacuum that China was able to fill.
I think that would happen anyway, but you might say we gave it a little catalytic effect, accelerated a little bit. The country though that I see reflecting that most vividly and still very concerned about the United States, and so it is rearming, refitting, and probably going to be a fully up nuclear power in another decade and a half, is Japan. I think Japan has figured out that the nuclear umbrella, the public good of national security that we've provided so they could maintain 1% of GDP and so forth, I think they've decided that's, or at least a part of their government has decided that that's no longer trustworthy. And so Abe is moving rapidly, really rapidly, to essentially make Japan a normal nation. And I think eventually that means nuclear weapons.
So that shift, you don't think though was, China's rise in your view was inevitable anyway?
I think U.S. power has been diminishing since about 72. I think China's power has been rising, as have others. I think part of the U.S. diminishment in power has been self-inflicted, but part of it has also been natural. China's has been natural to the extent that the Chinese leadership has managed its economy. India's has been natural and democratic, basically, but it's happening. And to say that this or that policy caused it to happen, I think is false. It might have accelerated it, and that might be injurious that it accelerated it, but it was happening anyway.
Might we have made a bigger difference in China domestically had we not been so focused on counterterrorism and been so happy to, step back as far as the Uyghurs are concerned, for instance, or other human rights issues in China?
That's a possibility. That's a possibility. If we had focused more on the most important portfolio we have in all its dimensions, and had we exercised astute diplomacy and not been so diverted from that, we might have helped China develop a little bit more democracy, if you will. Or I'm one of those who is not completely convinced that ruling 1 billion plus people is possible with democracy. I know you can give a lot more liberty and freedom, civil liberties in particular. You can probably be more like Iran is becoming. You can be more or less Ayatollah as a dictator in many senses, but there are a lot of voices in Iran, a lot of power centers. I think China could have been more like that. It could have been less draconian and developing, even I think, with the PLA's increased strength and money, despite the cuts. I think the Politburo is having to listen to the PLA now the way, for example, from time to time we have had to listen to our military. That is to say, if you've got it and you've paid for it, you better use it. I think that's happening in China now. We could have delayed that, or even derailed it and had it develop a little better. But we took our eye off the ball. We concentrated other places. I'm not saying that that could have happened. I'm just saying it's a possibility, and we left that opportunity on the table.
Was there a shift? This would be after you left office. So would you say there was a shift in Bush 2 in
Yes.
terms of...
I think when George Bush fired Donald Rumsfeld in November 2006, I think it was a sign, a very visible sign, that he had awakened to the fact that he was being manipulated, and in a way that was not just adverse to his own personal legacy, but to the country. And so I would say the last 3 years of the second term weren't all that bad. They were more typical, more like his father, for example. I'd give him credit for that. He actually took over personally the secure teleconference, video teleconference with Baghdad. I mean, he was the person our general was looking at on the screen, talking to him. You can say that's micromanaging, but at this point it needed to be micromanaged. The president did need to get involved. And I think he awakened to the fact that Cheney had been, to a certain extent, manipulating him. I saw the body language, and I know that Cheney and Bush are not too good of friends at this point. Had a lot to do with not pardoning Scooter Libby and other things. But the last meeting they had on Iran, had one of the people in the meeting tell me this happened, that they were all asked literally for a vote, did we want to use force against Iran? Before the Bush administration ended, did they want to use force against Iran? Because it wasn't working. They were building centrifuges hand over foot, or acquiring them. And everyone in the room was canvassed. The only person in the room that voted for use of force was Cheney, and Bush dismissed him instantly. Well, that's an indicator, I think, that the president had woken up.
What's your assessment of Dr. Rice as Secretary of State?
Mixed emotions. She continued a lot of things that Powell had put in place that we thought were absolutely essential to the revitalization of the Foreign Service, for example. And she continued some other things that we had put in place that were institutional, that we thought, because we both had the view that the State Department was being run circles around by the Defense Department because they had much better people at the Defense Department than we had at State. Not necessarily better people in terms of intellectual content. There were bright people at State, but they weren't being educated and trained and built up the way the Defense Department does. They weren't promoted the way the Defense Department does. Merit was not too often the consideration. It was sort of an old guys network, and who did the Director General like, and who was the guy who punched his tickets most in Washington. We had a situation where people who wanted to stay overseas and do their job, foreign service, were punished because they didn't come back to Washington and do their job in Washington and get to know all the political types and so forth. So she continued that sort of trying to refurbish the Foreign Service. In terms of policy itself, I think it was difficult to pick up the pieces after that first term, but to the extent that she could, she did a reasonable job. It was a difficult set of shoes to fall into, and if the president hadn't had his epiphany, I think it would have been impossible. But given that he did, and her proximity, her closeness to the president, they were able to keep things going pretty well.
From the Asia perspective, though, there was criticism that she was just a no-show
on
some multilateral platforms. And when Ambassador Armitage was here, he made a point of
noting
that.
Rich.
Why was that? Why did Dr. Rice not show up?
Well, I don't think she was comfortable in Asia. I think she was a Sovietologist. She spoke fluent Russian. I remember a story about her being with Gorbachev on a helicopter. They were flying over California, and they were pointing out the beautiful homes to Gorbachev and everything. And he turned to, was it Powell? Maybe it was Powell. Or maybe it was Condi herself who told me this. But anyway, who is this bright young lady who's translating here? And then talking. she was very comfortable in Europe and in that environment. She's not very comfortable in Asia. She didn't know it well. And so that's more important than people think. So I wouldn't criticize her for being totally immersed in the other end of the world, but I would say that it was a personality trait. It was a character trait, and that may have influenced her.
How did approaching Asia require something different? I mean, what did it require?
Well, I think first of all, it requires a blinders off approach to Beijing. You have to face it up front, both in terms of economic policy, trade policy, and in terms of security policy, and what that means for all the other people you're trying to court to build a hedging strategy. That includes Delhi, that includes Jakarta, that includes Tokyo and Seoul. That's a difficult dance. It's really hard to convince your diplomatic partner over here that your real interest is in his growing up to be a responsible regional and global stakeholder, to quote the State Department and the White House. At the same time, you're talking to Delhi about how you might have to counter China someday. It's hard. It's difficult diplomacy. And I would say we have done a reasonably good job of it. But it does call from time to time for criticism from those various capitals because they think we haven't done it quite right, vis-a-vis them, and maybe even vis-a-vis China. It's hard. It's a difficult dance. It's a kabuki dance.
Do you think Secretary Powell did it well?
I do. I remember one particular Navy commander who had really incredible contacts in Beijing because he spoke fluent Mandarin, and he had been in and out of China ever since, well, I met him for the first time when I went there in '85, which was really early in the burgeoning mill-to-mill relationship. And he said, you know what they're calling him? He came into my office and he said, you know what they're calling your boss? I said, what? He said, they're calling him Bao Kun. And I said, wow, that's got some Bao Kun. And he said, yeah, it's sort of their transliteration of Powell, of Colin Powell. And he said, it's not a derogatory term. They really like him. They really like him. You need to exploit this. You need to exploit this. And I've got these business deals. You know, he was always working on his business deals. But I think his report was an accurate one. I think Chen Chi-chen and he got along really well. I think I think by and large, with the talking points out of the way, you know, the typical human rights on our side, Taiwan on their side, and so forth, the dialogue was pretty effective, pretty good. I'd call it, not just for the communique purposes, you know, we had a reasonable, good dialogue, you know. They really did. A lot of issues were covered, a lot of points were made, a lot of issues were solved, at least enough to the point where both sides could claim they had made progress. And that's what diplomacy is all about. I think basically Powell did a good job with respect to China.
Do you think his
gets a little credit for it, because everybody's focused on Iraq and, you know, his presentation at the UN and so forth.
Do you think his military background and the fact that he had people like Armitage and you know, who have military backgrounds, working in the State Department, did that make a difference?
I think it brought respect from some parties that it wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, John Kerry to a certain extent because he was a Navy SEAL and he was in Vietnam, but he doesn't have nearly the bona fides Powell did. And with some governments, it really is important. Oddly enough, it's important with the Japanese government. They want to know that the people entrusted with their security are competent. And that's one reason they like Republicans more than they do Democrats, I think, and because Republicans, at least until George W. Bush, seemed to handle the national security business better than the Democrats. They didn't like Clinton at all. The Japanese didn't. Well, I should say the one, Koizumi and others that we dealt with. They thought Clinton was nuts and not interested in Japan's security. They were very glad to see George W. come on board. I can't tell you how many Japanese shook my hand and welcomed me.
And incidentally, all three of you too have experience in Asia prior to your
Yes. Yeah.
government service.
Yes.
How much did that play a part in your understanding?
Well, with Rich, of course, it opened all kinds of doors that wouldn't have been open otherwise. I would say particularly on Taiwan. I mean, he was a real force with keeping Chen Shui-bian in check and convincing him that what he was doing might be quite dangerous. And with Japan, to a lesser extent with Korea, I like to think Jim and I were more impactful with Korea. I know Korea better than Rich. But yeah, he was an important ingredient in that, and Asia experience was an important ingredient in that. Condi didn't bring that, so she had that against her from the very start, you know. And she was a black woman. Meaning that there are people in the world who don't consider blacks that competent. By the way, most considered Powell as a very light person. You would be surprised how many people would mention that to me from time to time. Even blacks. Powell's not a real black. He's a white man with a little dark skin. Race still has both a domestic, certainly, component and an international component. Cuba has a real race problem.
What about in Asia? Was that an issue?
I don't think it's much of an issue. Of course, there are racial issues in Indonesia and other places, but I don't think it's looked at with the kind of passion it is in what I'll call white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in particular communities. I mean, there was a lot of angst over Obama in the White House because he's a black man. And people who deny it are just smoking something, because there is.
Looking back on your 4 years in the Bush 1 White House, what might you have done differently?
Oh, geez. Do we have 20 hours?
Well, in 20 seconds,
yeah.
Could you tell us?
Well, the first thing I would have done differently is I would have lived up to Powell's confirmation testimony and Bush's own campaign rhetoric. A balance of power that favors freedom, compassionate conservatism, working with our allies, getting the military out of the business of nation building and all that kind of stuff. Those are all really good points to my conservative Republican soul. And we didn't do them. We simply didn't do them. Look at what we did. We actually increased the size of the federal government, anathema to the Republican Party, by more than anyone since the 1947 Act, by creating the Homeland Security Department, a department that still does not know about its reason for existence, still has a bunch of disparate cultures in it that don't cooperate, corroborate, ever even talk to each other, as a matter of fact. It's a horrible place. I would never want to be secretary of that department. Should never have been created, and yet we did. This was a government that acted in opposition to all of its professed principles. It's just incredible. It's kind of like the freak show that is now occurring with the Republican candidates for president. You know, these people do not represent the United States of America. They represent a rabid, small majority of the United States. And yet they're a national political party. That's kind of the way the Bush administration turned out in its first 4 years.
Do you feel that, at least with Asia policy, did you and Colin Powell and you and Armitage leave the U.S. in a stronger place?
Maybe not a stronger place, but I think, as I said before, in a damage control sense, we've prohibited it or kept it from becoming really bad, especially with China. Because there were people in the administration, including the vice president, who saw that the United States needed an enemy, like the Soviet Union had been, in order to continue the spending on the military, to continue the spending on the industrial complex, military-industrial complex, to continue keeping the war instrument robust and warm. We needed an enemy. That was their philosophy. There's some reason and rationale to that thinking, and that China was it, naturally it, and they wanted to make that come about in terms that everyone identified with, the American people in particular, that the American people were scared to death of China. And they failed principally because of Powell and the president.
So they wanted to do that even though we already had a real live enemy down in the Middle East?
I don't think anybody considered that a real live enemy. They didn't even consider North Korea a real live enemy, a potential enemy that we might have to deal with someday. But, you always had 600,000 South Koreans who were quite capable of dealing with it themselves with a little U.S. air power. And in the Middle East, you always had Iran. And so, only if you were crazy did you go in there and mess that up. I remember a briefing in the Pentagon from another Air Force 3-star about how we were going to do Korea. We were going to attack North Korea. And he was guaranteeing the White House that he could get 80% of their nuclear infrastructure in the first strikes. He was a fool. There's no way. No way. You're not going to get 80% anywhere, even if you're in the middle of the desert. And yet he was standing there telling us and telling the White House he could get 80% of the targets. Well, the only reason that the White House didn't take that argument on board, I think, I'm not sure they would have acted on it, but the only reason was because Tenet was telling them that that Air Force general was an idiot, that some of this stuff was so deeply buried, there was no way they were going to get it. And oh, by the way, the Air Force didn't know any more than the CIA, and they didn't know where half of it was. But that's the kind of craziness you get sometimes at high levels of power.
What sort of foreign policy legacy did the Bush administration leave to the Obama administration?
Disaster. They left a lot of messes for the Obama administration to clean up. And the first term, I think, was a valiant effort. It was not all that successful, but it was a valiant effort to pick up some of that garbage and deal with it, and principally the transatlantic relationship, which Bush had repaired a little bit in those last 3 years. Condi had repaired a little bit. But President Obama had to continue that. And he had to continue it, as did Condi, with leadership that had no foot in the war, the World War II. So Powell and I had talked about this a lot of times. There is a transformation coming, and it is going to be dramatic. When we have leaders in London, in Paris, in Berlin, and elsewhere in Europe who don't remember the war, that is to say, they weren't in the war, they weren't alive, they weren't kids, they are new, and they don't see what the United States did for Europe in those times. They will be different, and they will be more realpolitik. They will want their own economic measures, their own trade measures, their own security, and so forth. And we need to prepare for that because it's going to be a very different world. Well, they've had to deal with that, and the fact that we ruptured the relationship so badly with Iraq, and not just in Europe. We really caused our allies and friends to begin thinking about our sanity.
So do you still meet with Secretary Powell frequently now?
Email all the time, face to face only every now and then, but email all the time.
Do you have a good sense of how he reflects back on that period?
He'd like to forget it. That's very candid, especially the UN presentation. He says every now and then, "I shall forever be remembered for that." And, implication, open parentheses, "I did so much else," close parentheses. But, it seems like that is what everyone remembers rather than the good things he did.
How do you see your own legacy in your role?
I wish I'd resigned, at least to make that statement and to get myself out of responsibility for 4,000 dead Americans and 300,000 dead Iraqis and a real mess.
Do you get a sense at all that other people, say Cheney or Rumsfeld, how they might be looking back at that period?
I don't think Don Rumsfeld has the capacity to look back. I don't think Cheney does either. I really think Cheney, I've had a number of very competent physicians, particularly in the neurosurgery field, actually send me emails. And these people just cold email me and tell me that they think there is a physiological reaction to heart surgery and to statins and the other chemicals you have to take as a result of heart surgery, and that they don't even know what the physiological reactions are in a pattern template-like way to heart replacement. And so they speculate with some dramatic backup in terms of their physician skills that Cheney has lost it, that he is now delusional, that he's having real problems, particularly with the chemicals he's having to take, and that probably the heart transplant was not nearly as successful in terms of his intellectual capacity as maybe the doctors would like to say it in George Washington or wherever. I think there's probably some truth to that, because Brent Scowcroft and others have told me they simply do not recognize Dick Cheney. And they knew him well when he was Chief of Staff to Jerry Ford, when he was a congressman, when he was Secretary of Defense. I knew him when he was Secretary of Defense. It's not the same individual. So I think there's actually some biological, physiological problems with Cheney. Bush, I think, if you read his book, and I'm sure you probably have, I think Bush shows some remorse, but he's just not the kind of person who can put it on his sleeve. And but his actual admission that if he'd known there were no WMD, he might have made a different decision was a colossal admission, in my view, for that triumvirate. I think it probably distanced him further from both men, Rumsfeld and Cheney. And his quiet, his silence, mostly in this time, has been an indicator too. I think he may feel some remorse. I hope he does anyway. But not Rumsfeld and Cheney, no. And not Feith. Feith is the most duplicitous. I wouldn't know how to describe Doug Feith. The Justice Committee in the Congress invited him and me to testify simultaneously. The chairman in the chair that day came down to me when I appeared and was sworn, and he said, Feith won't come. And Feith has said that he won't come because you are, quote, a lying sack of shit, unquote. And I said, well, the usual tactic of these people, they call you what they are. And he chuckled and he said, if I subpoena him and you, will you come back? I said, if you subpoena me, I have to come back, right? He said, well, I won't subpoena you, I'll subpoena him. Will you come back? I said, certainly. And nothing ever happened. He just didn't have the courage to do it. I think it was actually the Liberty and Security, or whatever it's called, Civil Rights, Constitution, and so forth, subcommittee of the Justice Committee. Conyers sat in, the chairman of the full committee, but Jerry Nadler ran the subcommittee, and Nadler was the one talking to me. I think he went to Conyers, and Conyers chickened out. Conyers wouldn't do it. But I was looking forward to that. I was looking forward to that, to have him there beside me. Strange man. And I believe in his heart of hearts a citizen of Israel. He is a citizen of Israel. He has dual citizenship. I think he's working for Israel, not for the United States.
Were you suggesting before, too, when you mentioned Paul Wolfowitz and sort of this new approach to the Middle East, are you suggesting that there's some...
No, I think Paul was conflicted. I think Paul was smart enough and American citizen enough that Paul was conflicted over what you might call loyalty to the security of Israel and his interpretation of the interests of the United States. I think Paul was smart enough, loyal enough to understand that Washington was right when he said, you never have coincidental interests with another nation. And when you think you do, you're in trouble. Washington, of course, was referring to France. But Paul said some things, did some things that would lead me to believe that he was no Feith. He was right there with the neoconservatives most of the time, intellectually, but he was no Feith. Feith, in my mind, was a traitor.
Now, you're working on a book now on presidential decision-making. What are your early conclusions as far as George W. Bush is concerned?
This might surprise you. And this comes from not just my own experience and research, but also 10 years of having my students present case studies, one of which is always every semester the Iraq War. My students, using the framework for analysis that I give them, which is David Rothkopf's out of his book, Running the World, top element of the framework is personalities, characters, and sociology of the team that actually makes the decisions. My students have come to the conclusion that I would articulate something like this. There were some really powerful people assembled around a very weak president. Not weak intellectually, so to speak, but weak because he had no experience at all. These people who were billed as the dream team by the press prior to the administration commencing all thought they were going to be president of the United States for their function. Powell thought he was going to be president for foreign policy. Rumsfeld for defense and foreign policy, because the Defense Department plays in foreign policy increasingly. Condi thought she was going to be president, and Cheney knew he was going to be president because what they had was an empty vessel. They all got surprised except Cheney. And Cheney was smarter, more ruthless, more strategic than all of them, and ran circles around them for at least 3 years, maybe 4, in domestic and international policy. I think they're onto something. That's what made it so dysfunctional too, because none of them were cooperating. All of them were button heads. All of them thought they were the king, the czar in their area, and none of them were. Cheney was. And the president's sitting back thinking he's the decider.
So do you think, what was it then? I mean, was it simply a lack of experience, or was there more to it?
A lack of experience matched against the most incredibly adept bureaucratic entrepreneur who was deeply experienced, and all this 800-pound gorilla fight around them, which Cheney totally ignored. He just drove on. If my boss was weak in any area, it was that he was naive and that he picked up on all this way too late. Cheney had already had a forced march on him. And it was very difficult to do damage control even because the vice president was so far ahead. I've expressed it this way in my manuscript. They had a strategy. They were ruthless in carrying it out. They had a network throughout the government to help them, and they executed brilliantly. And we were left in the dust.
Well,
so was the president.
Well, thank you.
Sure.